MPhil in Islamic Studies at the University of Cambridge and is currently a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Divinity, University of Cambridge, where the focus of his research is aesthetics in Ibn Arabi. His research interests are quite varied and include anthropology, specifically anthropology of art, the Platonic tradition and antiquity, Renaissance Platonism, German Romanticism and Heidegger, Islamic mystical thought, particularly Surawardi and Ibn Arabi, comparative religion and mysticism, and comparative aesthetics. I hope you're as excited as I am to hear about what Mr. Mahmoud has to say during his presentation of Color, Symbolism, and the Mystic Quest, the spiritual exegesis of color and Sufism in the works of Henry Corbin. Enjoy.
Thank you very much. While working on this paper, I decided to change the title from the title that was that's announced in the booklet to a more modest title called Reflections on Henry Corbin's Study of Color and Sufism. And the reason why I did that is because I found that before I can actually get into the Sufi literature on color, a lot has to be introduced about Corbin himself and the particular approach of the Sufis to the phenomenon of color. Henry Corbin is well known as being one of the greatest scholars on Sufism in the 20th century. He's a scholar in Islam, a student of Massignon. He wrote hundreds of works, but the ones I want to focus on here two papers or two works on color. The first is a book-length work titled The Man of Light in Iranian Sufism, in which he analyzes the symbolism of color and light in the works of Suhrawardi, Najumddin, Kubra, Simnani, and many others. And the second is an Eranos lecture given in 1972 on the general theme of color, especially realism and symbolism of color in Kermani. Now, unfortunately, Corbin's work on color has been neglected in the study of neglected entirely in the study of Islamic civilization, but particularly neglected by art historians who are most concerned with color and Islamic civilization, simply because Corbin's theories on color and his study of Sufism seem to be too far-fetched and mystical to be of any help in understanding Islamic art or architecture. Now, why invoke Henry Corbin in a conference on color in the first place? And what bearing does Sufism have on Islamic art and architecture? These are very difficult questions, and I won't get into this very difficult debate. Well, what I want to do is take advantage of the title of this conference and the diverse other hues, color in Islamic art and culture, and introduce a broad approach to the study of culture, or arts, particularly in the works of Sufis. But particular significance of Corbin for me is that he was able to present for a modern audience and in the language of contemporary philosophy, very difficult language and cosmology, an approach to phenomena and the mystical experience that we find in the Sufis. Any reader who picks up any Sufi work will find that the work is very difficult to understand and very inaccessible. And Corbin's value, for me at least, in relation to color, is his ability to translate, act as a cultural translator and mediator of these very difficult concepts and ideas. So I've chosen a number of themes in Corbin's own work to focus on. And having understood these themes, I think one can be able to manage a reading of, or enter the world of the Sufi, as it were. The first theme, very important theme, I think, is the question of approach towards a phenomenology of color. How does one actually approach the phenomenon of color? We take for granted the colors that we see around us, but the way we see the world is fundamentally different from the way that the Sufis saw the world. Jonathan Bloom, in his presentation earlier, gave a very brief glimpse of a scientific approach to the study of color, in which one can say that the distinction between different colors from scientific point of view, and I'm oversimplifying here, but just for the purpose of argument, in the sense that colors are distinguished between the different light vibrations, light wave vibrations. And it's kind of a quantitative approach to the study of color, which starkly contrasts with what I'm about to present shortly. But I want to give a very quick presentation of this quantitative approach, because this method is less scientist to distinguish between primary and secondary qualities of objects. Primary qualities being those that can be expressed mathematically, such as number, magnitude, position, motion, and shape. But all those other qualities that can't be expressed in this mathematical formula, like color, taste, and sound, are considered secondary, i.e. not very essential for the understanding of the actual phenomenon itself. At best, when these secondary phenomena are explained, they're explained in terms of primary phenomenon. So color is explained in terms of the primary phenomenon of light wave vibrations, rather than explaining color as we experience it and as it presents itself. Emotional responses, existential moods, inner movements of the soul that result from the act of perceiving a color, which is what artists and poets are constantly preoccupied with. All those features of the perception of nature which are most immediately experienced and are judged to be unreal or mere illusions of the senses. They're subjective responses that have no bearing on the phenomenon under observation and therefore are rejected or at best ignored. So by quantifying the phenomenon of color into measurable light wave vibrations, all those subjective elements that hinder the objective understanding of reality are circumvented, which is a very convenient way of approaching color. If we can't formulate it in mathematical formulas, we'll go around it and try to quantify it into measurable units and in terms other than the way we actually experience and perceive it. Rather than build a theory based on the immediate sense data, paradoxically, scientific approach inadvertently subverts the immediate experience of color, or the immediate appearance of color, by going behind it and explaining it in terms of a hidden mechanism, supposed to be more real than what is observed. This abstract representation of the phenomenon is held up as a mirror to nature. But the actual experience of human beings is with qualities and not with quantities. People don't immediately experience numbers and mathematical formulas. The latter are abstracted from the immediately experienced sensory qualities. Now, so rather than explain color as it appears to us, it is converted into measurable units and mathematical formulas. Is this explaining color or explaining it away? I'm not offering here a rejection of scientific approach by any means, but what I'm offering here is, from a Sufi perspective at least, a critique of its limitations. And I have a very interesting quote here from a German philosopher in his Schelling, who makes the following very important observation, which actually articulates the challenges of coming to terms with color that I'm trying to express here. And I quote, "First and above all, an explanation must do justice to the thing that is to be explained. It must not devalue it, interpret it away, belittle it, or garble it in order to make it easier to understand. The question is not at what view of the phenomenon must we arrive in order to explain it in accordance with one or another philosophy, but precisely the reverse. What philosophy is requisite if we are to live up to the subject, be on level with it? The question is not how the phenomenon must be turned, twisted, narrowed, crippled, so as to be explicable at all costs, upon principles that we have once and for all resolved not to go beyond. The question is to what point must we enlarge our thought so that it shall be in proportion to the phenomenon itself." Corbin's work on color can be seen as an attempt to answer this question. To what point must we enlarge our thought, in this case in relation to color, so that it shall be in proportion to the phenomenon? Corbin was very highly critical of approaches that turned, twisted, narrowed, and crippled the phenomenon so as to be explicable at all costs. And so everything hinges on how we see and approach the phenomenon itself, which is why I'm focusing on it so much here. The act of perception is not neutral. One does not passively receive sense data from the world. The act of perception is constitutive of what we receive of the world. In fact, the Arabic word for to perceive, adraka, suggests as much. It means to reach out, to reach. So in the widest possible sense, then, perception belongs to ethics, insofar as what one sees of the world depends on how one approaches it. An approach to the phenomenon that twists, turns, and narrows and cripples it to make it explicable at all costs does violence to the phenomenon itself. Is it possible to let the phenomenon speak for itself, without imposing it into preconceived categories? If so, what does such an approach look like? To this end, Corbin adopted the method of phenomenology. And I don't want to get into the history of the tradition of phenomenology in the 20th century thought, but what I want to take away from this particular approach, especially for Corbin, was the notion of the saving of appearance, the original Greek implications of phenomenology. It is the saving of the appearance of what shows itself forth. And the reason why Corbin invoked phenomenology, because he found it a very convenient 20th century intellectual tool that goes back to the Greeks to articulate and explain how, and we shall see later how this is possible, how the Sufi approach or the mystical approach to phenomenon tries to save the very mode in which things appear to us, the very mode in which we see them and perceive them, rather than go around the phenomenon to explain it in mathematical quantified formulas, which is fine, not at the expense of the immediate way in which we perceive things and experience them. And so Corbin defined phenomenology as a method which attempts to save the phenomenon by ultimately unveiling that which is hidden and concealed beneath the appearance. In this way, the method of phenomenology enlarges our thought in order to comprehend the phenomenon, rather than force the phenomenon into preconceived theoretical categories. Now, the phenomenon here corresponds to what in Islam Corbin found the notion of the Zahir, the apparent or the external. That which shows itself forth through the phenomenon, or the Zahir, is ultimately called the Batin. So the Zahir is that which appears to us in the phenomenal reality of the world, but behind the phenomenal reality of the world, and I'll explain what I mean by behind in a minute, is the concealed dimension of that which is appearing. According to Islamic cosmology, where God is al-Zahir and al-Batin, there is a dignity and ontological value to the very appearance of things. The things of the world are understood as symbols, ayat, or ciphers of the divine, where a world of appearances and multiplicity that ultimately, when properly conceived and perceived, leads ultimately to the realization of the unity of God. This is why Corbin found the profound philosophical and phenomenological meditations on the cosmos by the mystics of Islam so illuminating. In the writings of the Sufis, Corbin found the lineaments of an approach to phenomenon that possessed such a rigorous fidelity to the appearance of things that he translated phenomenology in terms of the Islamic practice of kashf al-mahjub, or literally the unveiling or revealing of that which is hidden, that which is concealed beneath the appearance. Now, there are other Islamic practices which he dwelled on. I can't get into detailed, but I want to mention here ta'wil, from the Arabic awwala, which means the process of tracing something back to its origin, and ta'bir, literally the crossing over from the zahir to the batin. And both these terms, including kashf al-mahjub, suggest a movement, an appreciation of the very appearance of things, but then a movement into their depths. It must be understood, though, that the hidden dimension of the appearance of things is not the behind the phenomenon as something other. It's not circumventing the appearance of things and explaining it in terms of something else. It's entering into the very depth of the phenomenon through its appearance, the way it presents itself to our senses. Although the zahir conceals the batin, there is no intrinsic distinction between internal reality and external appearance. Rather, the zahir is the form in which the batin appears. The phenomenal manifestation is the place or the epiphany of the hidden reality, but it is never exhausted by it. Therefore, the zahir and the batin do not stand against each other, but are two faces of the same reality. And this goes against the notion, the general notion that Sufism denigrates the appearance of things and always suggests the movement to the batin. This is true, but not at the expense of the appearance of things. There's a dignity to the appearance of things which one cannot deny, or no Sufi can deny, because of the Quranic verse where God describes himself as al-Zahir and al-Batin. Color then, in this instance, from this perspective, is not turned, twisted, narrowed, and crippled, but saved as an intrinsic and primary quality of the world. But color in its mode of appearing and in the mode in which we experience it. It is an essential dimension to the phenomenon in which that which is hidden behind the appearance is making itself visible. The phenomenology of colors, then, or the kashf al-mahjub, found in the spiritual meditations of the Sufis, then, is based on the immediate data of sense perception, the madahir, or the perceivable qualities, and thus yields a very different theory of colors than from the scientific. Not necessarily contradictory, but one that accounts for the qualities and primary experience of colors. Najumddin Kubra, one of the great mystics and Sufis that Corbin worked on, provides a very interesting meditation on the greenness of plants. He says, the effect of gazing at greenery is such that one senses a racing of the heart, an expansion of the breast, a pleasing sensation in the soul, a sweet taste for the spirit, and a refreshing sensation for the inner eye. And of course, he takes his cue from the prophetic hadith, where the Prophet ﷺ says that, the tradition that says that he enjoyed gazing at greenery. Now, paradoxically then, the Sufis seem to possess a greater fidelity to the sensual appearance of things than most scientists do. It's a very interesting paradox. Ibn Arabi articulated this very well when he said, the senses never err, or the senses are never mistaken. It is the judging faculty that makes the mistakes. And interestingly enough, Goethe, many centuries later, said something very similar, to the effect that the senses do not deceive, it's the judging faculty that deceives. There's such a trust of the senses and the way in which it receives the world and perceives the world. It is the judging faculty, it is that faculty which interprets, as it were, or imposes abstract categories onto the immediate perception of things. That is where for Corbin, the error comes from. Now, so far we have been speaking about phenomenon of the visible world. However, Islamic cosmology inspired by the Quran speaks of two worlds, the seen and the unseen, or the physical world, alam al-shahada, and the spiritual or invisible world, alam al-ghayb. Such a vision of reality provides a very rich symbolic understanding of existence. The visible or seen world is described as the outer world, or the Zahir, while the invisible or the unseen world is described as the inward, or the Batin. According to Ghazali, for example, everything in the visible world is a symbol or mathal, similitude, of something in the invisible or unseen worlds. And the unseen worlds rise above the physical world and form a hierarchy. Now, this presents us with a very important question in relation to color. For a cosmology that posits a hierarchy of worlds, is color merely a quality of the physical world around us, or is it a quality of phenomena that extend into the supra-sensory worlds, the other worlds of alam? Is it a quality of just physical objects, or is it a quality of existent things? Is it possible to ascend from the colors of this world without there being their homologues or correspondent in the other worlds? Now, several Quranic verses and hadiths are adduced to testify to the fact that colors are objectively real and they exist at all levels of existence. The Quran describes the colors of the garments of the inhabitants of heaven, the colors of the different rivers, the gems of the inhabitants of heaven, the colors of the faces on the Day of Judgment. In the hadith literature, we find traditions related to the lights of the pillars of the throne, which are usually identified as red, white, yellow, and green. The white dome with 1,000 gates of red gold, seen by the Prophet ﷺ in his nocturnal journey, al-Mi'raj. The colors of the veils that were lifted during his Mi'raj,